Okay, so today we're going deep on Nigel Farage.
Mm-hmm.
This time we've got a really interesting conversation he had with Jordan Peterson as our main source material.
Right.
And we're going to be focusing on three main areas.
Yeah.
His view on net zero, his opinions on what he calls cultural decay, and his ideas for national revival in Britain.
Yeah. Big topics.
It's a lot to unpack, but
Yeah.
we'll try and get through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
One of the first things that really struck me was Farage's view of the current political landscape.
Yeah, he's not exactly shy about sharing his opinions, is he?
No, not at all. He comes right out and says the Conservative Party isn't truly conservative despite being in power for so long. What do you make of that?
Well, he backs it up with some pretty specific examples.
Like what?
For instance, he points to the tax burden in the UK.
Right.
He claims it's the highest it's been since 1947.
Wow.
And to him, that's not exactly a sign of conservative fiscal policy.
Definitely not a low tax agenda.
Right. He also goes on about the level of legal immigration.
Which has been a hot topic for a while now.
Exactly. He calls it unprecedented and directly links it
Yeah.
to the conservative leadership.
And then there's the whole issue of illegal immigration, which he ties pretty closely to the small boat crossings.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge point for him. He basically argues that the government's hands are tied because of the European Convention on Human Rights.
So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And he claims it's made them ineffective in tackling the issue.
It's interesting how he singles out net zero as being enshrined into law by a conservative government.
Right.
And he even mentions Boris Johnson and Theresa May specifically as big supporters.
Yeah, it seems like for Farage, net zero is a prime example of where the conservatives have strayed from what he considers true conservatism.
It's more than just a disagreement over policy. It's like a betrayal of core principles for him.
I think that's a fair assessment.
And then we get to his full-on attack on net zero.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches there.
No, he calls it an appalling policy. A complete and utter disaster. Why is he so vehemently against it?
Well, there are a few key arguments he lays out.
Okay, lay 'em on me.
One of the biggest is about energy independence.
Right?
He says even if we accept that gas and oil will still be part of the energy mix until 2050, and that's something even a lot of net zero proponents agree on.
They do.
Yeah. So he's saying if we're going to need it, we should be producing it ourselves.
It makes sense on the surface.
Right. He sees it as a matter of national security and just basic common sense.
So it's not just about the environment for him.
No. It's about taking control of your own destiny as a nation.
And this ties into his critique of deindustrialization, especially when it comes to things like steel production.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His point is that shutting down these industries in the UK doesn't really solve the problem. It just shifts it somewhere else.
Because demand doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. So these factories just pop up in countries with lower environmental standards, and then we end up importing the steel anyway.
Which probably comes with an even bigger carbon footprint because of transportation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He uses the closures in Redcar and South Wales as examples.
Places where the UK lost jobs and manufacturing capacity.
Right. And potentially for no net environmental benefit.
So he sees it as a symbolic gesture that actually backfires.
Yeah, it's environmentalism that hurts the economy and maybe even the planet in the long run.
And he doesn't stop there. He brings up the cost of energy in the UK.
Oh, yeah, he really hammers that point home.
He claims it's 4 to 6 times higher than in America.
Which obviously has major implications for businesses and for ordinary people trying to make ends meet.
It's hard to compete when your energy bills are through the roof.
Right. And he argues this disproportionately affects the poorest in society, even with those 20% subsidies on electricity bills.
Which most people probably don't even know about.
Exactly. And to top it all off, he reminds us that the UK is currently importing a chunk of its electricity, which makes us reliant on other countries.
So for Farage, net zero is about way more than just the environment.
It really is. It's tied to the economy, to national security, to social equality. It's about the future of Britain as he sees it.
Okay, so we've covered his views on the political landscape and net zero. Now let's move on to something a little different. His thoughts on family policy and what he calls cultural decay.
This is where he gets into some really interesting territory.
He brings up this idea of a circle of tolerance. What's he talking about there?
So he doesn't explicitly define it in this conversation, but based on his other arguments, it seems like he's talking about the boundaries of acceptable behavior in society.
Like there are certain limits to what we tolerate.
Right. He suggests that having shared values and a sense of what's right and wrong is essential for a society to function properly.
It's like the glue that holds everything together.
Yeah, and he clearly feels like those boundaries are being pushed or maybe even broken down.
And he makes it very personal by saying his motivation for getting back into politics is family, community, and country.
Those are his big three.
It's like he feels a duty to protect these core elements of British society.
Absolutely. He sees them as under threat.
And he also talks about the importance of Judeo-Christian culture as a foundation for Western identity.
Yeah, that's a key part of his argument. He sees this shared cultural heritage as essential for maintaining a sense of national unity and a strong moral compass.
And he connects this to the need for higher birth rates.
Right. He believes a nation needs a growing population to thrive, and he ties that directly to a sense of optimism about the future.
So if people are feeling pessimistic about the future, they're less likely to have kids.
That's his thinking.
Yeah.
He basically argues that a positive national outlook is essential for encouraging people to start families.
That's an interesting connection.
Yeah, it's not something you hear politicians talk about every day.
But then he gets pretty critical of what he sees as a decline in certain values.
Oh yeah, he really goes after what he perceives as a disincentive to work hard and achieve success.
So he's worried that people aren't being rewarded for their efforts.
And he specifically calls out the rising number of young people claiming disability benefits for depression.
Which he seems to view as a sign of weakness or a lack of resilience.
Right. He thinks there needs to be a shift back to a more self-reliant mindset.
He actually calls for a complete 180 shift in attitudes to recapture the spirit of the late 80s and early 90s.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah. What do you think he's getting at there?
It seems like he looks back at that period as a time of greater optimism and economic growth.
Maybe a time when people were more willing to roll up their sleeves and get things done.
That's the image he's painting, and he clearly feels like something has been lost along the way.
And he doesn't hold back on his criticism of the current political leadership.
He even calls out Rachel Reeves by name.
He's definitely not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
It seems like he believes a fundamental change in direction is needed, both in terms of policy and in terms of the overall mindset of the country.
So how does he propose to fix all this?
Well, this is where he gets into his blueprint for national revival.
Which sounds pretty grand.
It does, right? The two main pillars are reindustrialization and energy independence.
Okay, so bring back manufacturing and make sure we're producing our own energy.
Exactly. He wants to see Britain become a powerhouse again, both economically and in terms of its energy production. He even talks about the possibility of becoming a net energy exporter.
So not just self-sufficient, but actually selling energy to other countries.
That's the goal. He argues that this would make Britain stronger and more influential on the world stage.
It's a bold vision.
It is. And he connects this to a really interesting point about the relationship between wealth creation and environmental responsibility.
Go on.
He argues that the best way to address environmental problems, especially in developing countries, is through economic development.
So lift people out of poverty and they'll be in a better position to take care of the environment.
That's his theory. He believes that wealthier societies are more likely to prioritize and invest in environmental protection.
So it's not a question of either. It's about creating a virtuous cycle.
Exactly. He sees economic growth as a necessary foundation for a sustainable future.
Okay, so to recap, Nigel Farage paints a pretty bleak picture of where Britain is headed.
Yeah, he's definitely critical of the current state of affairs.
He argues that the Conservative government has abandoned its core principles.
Especially when it comes to things like taxation, immigration, and of course net zero.
And he sees net zero as a symbolic policy that's actually harmful to the economy and potentially even to the environment in the long run.
He makes a compelling case, and he's not afraid to back it up with hard numbers and real-world examples.
He also expresses deep concern about what he sees as cultural decay.
He's worried about declining values, a lack of optimism, and a weakening of the work ethic.
He sees all of these things as interconnected.
Absolutely. It's like a domino effect in his mind.
And his solution is a return to more traditional values.
Coupled with a renewed focus on economic growth and national self-reliance.
He wants to see Britain become a strong and independent nation once again.
Through hard work, innovation, and a rediscovery of its core values.
And he believes that this is not only the best path for Britain, but also the best way to contribute to solving global problems.
It's a powerful message, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
As always, it's important to remember that we're just presenting the ideas and arguments as they were expressed in the source material.
We're not endorsing any particular viewpoint.
Our goal is to give you, the listener, the information you need to form your own opinions.
So we've laid out Farage's perspective. Now it's your turn to think critically and decide what you believe.
What do you see as the biggest challenges facing Britain today? And what do you think are the best ways to address them?
It's a complex question with no easy answers.
But it's a question we all need to be asking ourselves.
If we want to create a better future for Britain and for the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
Until next time.
Keep thinking critically and keep questioning everything.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you back here soon for another deep dive.
Sounds good.